The David Thompson story. The gavel came down hard. Life sentence without parole. David Thompson stood perfectly still as the courtroom erupted around him. He could have spoken up, could have told them the truth about that night. But sometimes, protecting others means sacrificing yourself. Life sentence without parole. That's how long David Thompson sat in a maximum security prison cell for a murder he didn't commit. But when the DNA results came back in 2024, they didn't just prove his innocence. They revealed he was the hero who saved 3 lives that night. Welcome to Justice System USA, where we bring you the untold stories of America's legal system. Before we continue with David's incredible story, tell me in the comments what city are you watching from today? And if you believe stories of justice and redemption deserve to be heard, hit that subscribe button. These stories matter, and your support helps us keep bringing them to light. The night that changed everything. March 15, 2004, started like any other Tuesday for David Thompson. The 34-year-old auto worker finished his night shift at the Ford plant in Dearborn at 11:30 p.m. Exhausted from another 14-hour day, David had been pulling double shifts for months, trying to save enough money to move his 8-year-old daughter Emma to a better neighborhood. Since his wife Maria had died in a car accident 2 years earlier, David had become both mother and father to the little girl, who looked exactly like her mother when she smiled. The walk home from the plant took David through a quiet residential area about 15 minutes from his small apartment. He preferred walking to driving. It gave him time to decompose from the noise and stress of the assembly line, and the exercise helped him sleep better during the few hours he had before Emma woke up for school. That night, the March air was crisp and clear, and David was thinking about Emma's upcoming birthday when he heard the screaming. It was coming from a 2-story house at 425 Oak Street, a modest home with a well-maintained lawn and children's toys scattered across the front porch. Through the large front window, David could see figures moving frantically inside. The porch light was on, and the blinds were partially open, giving him a clear view into what was obviously a terrifying situation. A man in a black hoodie and jeans held a silver handgun pointed at a family huddled together on their living room floor. David could see a woman with blonde hair clutching 2 small children, a boy who couldn't have been older than 6 and a girl maybe Emma's age. The father, a thin man with glasses, was trying to position himself between the gunman and his family, his hands raised in a gesture of surrender. David had seen enough violence in his 34 years to recognize when someone was about to die. The gunman was agitated, pacing back and forth, and his body language suggested he was working up the courage to pull the trigger. This wasn't a robbery that had gone wrong, this was an execution being planned, a father's impossible choice. For a moment, David considered his options. He could call 911 and wait for police to arrive, but that would take at least 10 minutes, and these people didn't have 10 minutes. He could bang on the door or windows to create a distraction, but that might startle the gunman into shooting immediately. Or he could do what every instinct and his 2 decades of military training told him to do: act decisively to save innocent lives. David had served in the Army from 1988 to 1992, including a deployment to the Persian Gulf. He wasn't some civilian playing hero. He was a combat veteran who understood violence and knew how to control it. But he was also a single father who couldn't afford to get killed in someone else's crisis. Emma needed him. She'd already lost her mother. Losing her father would destroy what remained of her childhood. But as David watched the gunman raise his weapon and point it directly at the little girl's head, the decision made itself. He couldn't live with himself. If he walked away and read about a family massacre in tomorrow's newspaper, some things mattered more than personal safety. David circled to the back of the house, moving quietly across the darkened yard. A small deck led to a sliding glass door that appeared to be slightly ajar, probably how the intruder had gained entry. David tested the door carefully and found it unlocked. He slipped inside what appeared to be a kitchen, his footsteps muffled by a throw rug. From the kitchen, David could hear the gunman's voice more clearly. The man was demanding money, becoming increasingly angry as the family explained they didn't keep large amounts of cash in the house. David recognized the tone. He'd heard it in combat situations when frightened, desperate people were about to do something irreversible. "I don't believe you," the gunman was saying. "People like you always have money hidden somewhere. You've got 30 seconds to tell me where it is, or I start with the kids." When heroes are born, David moved through the kitchen into a hallway that led toward the living room. He could see the back of the gunman's head now, maybe 15 feet away. The man was focused entirely on his victims, completely unaware that someone had entered the house behind him. David Thompson had a choice to make, and he had about 20 seconds to make it. He could try to sneak back out and call for help, knowing that a family would probably die while he was explaining the situation to a 911 operator. He could try to talk the gunman down, but that would likely result in a hostage situation that could go wrong in a dozen different ways. Or he could use his military training to neutralize the threat immediately and permanently. The gunman stepped closer to the family, his weapon now inches from the father's head. "Time's up," he said, and David heard the distinctive click of a hammer being cocked. David didn't hesitate. He launched himself forward, covering the 15 feet between himself and the gunman in 3 quick strides. His shoulder caught the intruder in the middle of the back, sending both men crashing into a coffee table that shattered under their combined weight. The gun flew from the intruder's hand, skittering across the hardwood floor toward the kitchen hallway. Both men scrambled after it, but David was faster and more determined. He grabbed the weapon just as the gunman recovered and lunged at him. What happened next would be debated in courtrooms and analyzed by forensic experts for the next 20 years. The two men struggled violently for control of the gun, rolling across the floor, crashing into furniture, fighting with the desperate intensity of people who understood that only one of them would walk away from this encounter. During the struggle, the weapon discharged twice. The first shot went wild, embedding itself in the living room wall about 4 feet above where the family was still huddled. The second shot, fired as David and the intruder rolled across the floor, wrestling for the gun, found its target. Raymond Cole, though David wouldn't learn the gunman's name until 20 years later, was struck in the chest by a bullet fired from his own weapon. The wound was immediately fatal. He collapsed onto the blood-stained hardwood floor and died within seconds, his eyes staring sightlessly at the ceiling of a house he'd entered intending to rob and planned to leave soaked in innocent blood. The wrong man in handcuffs. David Thompson stood over the body, breathing heavily, the smoking gun still in his hand. Around him, the Carter family, William, Michelle, 6-year-old Michael, and 8-year-old Jessica stared in shock and terror. They were alive, unhurt, and safe. But in the chaos and adrenaline of the moment, they couldn't process what had just happened or who the man standing in their living room really was. When sirens began wailing in the distance, someone in the neighborhood, having heard the gunshots and called police, David set the gun down on the coffee table and knelt beside the Carter family. "It's over," he said quietly. "You're safe now. The police are coming." But David Thompson had no idea that the arrival of those police cars would mark the beginning of a 20-year nightmare that would cost him everything he'd ever worked for and separate him from the only person in the world who mattered to him. The first police officers through the door found a scene that told a simple, straightforward story: a dead body, a smoking gun, and a black man standing over both. In the chaos of the moment, with a traumatized family giving fragmented, contradictory statements, the narrative that emerged was not the story of a hero who had risked his life to save strangers. Detective Maria Rodriguez, the first investigator on scene, would later admit that she and her colleagues made critical errors in those first crucial hours. They didn't properly secure the back door where the real intruder had entered. They didn't collect evidence that would have shown Raymond Cole's criminal history of home invasions. They didn't notice the zip ties and duct tape Cole had brought to restrain his victims before killing them. Instead, they saw what appeared to be a home invasion gone wrong, with David Thompson as the obvious perpetrator. The gun was in his hands. The family couldn't provide a clear, consistent account of what had happened, and David, still in shock from the violence and focused entirely on making sure the Carters were physically unharmed, didn't immediately understand that he needed to explain his own actions. Justice goes blind. By the time David realized he was being viewed as a suspect rather than a good Samaritan, the damage was done. His attempts to explain what had really happened were dismissed as the typical lies of a guilty man trying to avoid responsibility. The physical evidence that would have supported his version of events was either missed, misinterpreted, or contaminated by the crime scene processing. District Attorney Rachel Stone was 3 months away from a difficult re-election campaign when the David Thompson case landed on her desk. She was trailing in the polls against a challenger who accused her of being soft on violent crime. A quick conviction in a high-profile murder case was exactly what her campaign needed. The case she presented to the jury was compelling in its simplicity. David Thompson had entered the Carter home, intending to rob the family. When William Carter resisted, Thompson had shot and killed him. The story had the advantage of being easy to understand and nearly impossible to disprove, since the only witness to contradict it was dead. What the jury never heard was Raymond Cole's criminal history: 15 arrests for burglary, assault, and armed robbery. They didn't learn about the duct tape and zip ties found in Cole's pockets, clear evidence that he'd planned to restrain his victims before killing them. They weren't told about the broken window at the back of the house that Cole had used to gain entry, or the fact that none of David Thompson's fingerprints were found on that window. David's court-appointed attorney, Robert Martinez, was handling 47 active cases when he was assigned to defend a man facing life in prison. Martinez was a good lawyer, but he was overworked, underpaid, and unprepared for a murder case of this magnitude. Critical evidence was overlooked. Key witnesses weren't called. The defense that could have saved David Thompson was never properly presented. The price of protecting others, but perhaps most damaging to his case, David Thompson himself made a decision that sealed his fate. When Martinez suggested they argue self-defense by claiming Raymond Cole had been armed and threatening, David refused. "Those people have been through enough," he said. "I won't put them through a trial where they have to relive every moment of that night just to save myself. If telling the truth means they suffer more, then I'll keep quiet." David could have pointed out inconsistencies in the family's testimony. He could have suggested they were lying or confused. He could have fought dirty to save himself. Instead, David Thompson chose to protect the very people whose confused, traumatized testimony was sending him to prison. The trial lasted 3 weeks. The jury deliberated for 18 hours before returning with a unanimous verdict: guilty of murder in the first degree, as Judge Harold Patterson pronounced the sentence: life in prison without the possibility of parole. David Thompson closed his eyes and thought about his daughter Emma. She was 8 years old and about to grow up without her father, all because he had chosen to save strangers instead of walking away. Social services would place her with his sister Angela in Chicago, hundreds of miles away from everything she'd ever known. David Thompson was about to lose everything that mattered to him, and he'd done it by being exactly the kind of man he'd always tried to be. 20 years in the shadows. Prison became David's world for the next 20 years. Cell Block D in Michigan's maximum security facility at Jackson was home to the state's most dangerous criminals, murderers, gang leaders, and men who would never again breathe free air. David was assigned to Cell 247, a space barely large enough for a narrow cot, a stainless steel toilet, and a small desk where inmates could write letters or read books. For a man who had never been in trouble with the law, who had served his country honorably and worked hard to provide for his family. The adjustment to prison life was brutal, but David had learned in the army how to survive in hostile environments, and he applied those lessons to his new reality. He kept to himself, avoided confrontations, and earned the respect of other inmates through quiet competence rather than violence or intimidation. When fights broke out in the yard, David walked away. When newer inmates asked about his case, he politely declined to discuss it. When gang members tried to recruit him for protection or profit, he made it clear he wasn't interested without disrespecting anyone. Other inmates found David Thompson to be an enigma. Most men in maximum security were either loudly proclaiming their innocence or proudly detailing their crimes. David did neither. He simply existed, serving his sentence with a dignity that seemed impossible under the circumstances. After his first year, David earned his GED through correspondence courses. After his third year, he completed a bachelor's degree in social work. After his fifth year, he was working in the prison library, helping other inmates with their legal appeals and educational goals. He never filed an appeal of his own conviction. A daughter's unwavering faith. Every Sunday for 20 years, his daughter Emma made the 4-hour drive from Chicago to visit her father. She was 8 when he was convicted, and 28 when the truth finally came to light. For 2 decades, she sat across from him in the sterile visiting room, never losing faith in his innocence, even when he wouldn't discuss the details of his case. "Dad," she would say during those visits, "I know you didn't murder anyone. I don't know exactly what happened that night, but I know who you are. You've never hurt anyone in your life." David would smile sadly and change the subject to her job. her education, her relationships, anything but the case that had destroyed their family. He couldn't tell her the truth, that her father was a hero who had chosen 20 years in prison rather than put a traumatized family through additional suffering in court. By 2024, advances in DNA technology had revolutionized criminal justice. Cold cases that had been unsolvable for decades were being cracked with genetic evidence that hadn't existed when the crimes were committed. Innocent people who had spent years in prison were being exonerated as science caught up to their cases. Emma Thompson, now a paralegal working for a civil rights law firm in Chicago, had never stopped believing in her father's innocence. She had spent years learning about wrongful convictions, studying legal precedents, and saving money to pay for advanced forensic testing that hadn't been available in 2004. The DNA that changed everything. The testing she commissioned focused on evidence that had been collected from the crime scene but never properly analyzed. Skin cells found under Raymond Cole's fingernails, blood spatter patterns on the living room walls, and trace evidence from the violent struggle between David and the gunman. What the DNA results revealed in March 2024 would vindicate everything. David Thompson had sacrificed and shocked everyone who had been involved in his conviction 20 years earlier. The skin cells under Raymond Cole's fingernails didn't belong to David Thompson. They belonged to William Carter, the father who had been trying to protect his family when Cole grabbed him during the initial confrontation. The DNA proved that Cole had been the aggressor, not David. More importantly, the blood spatter analysis conducted with technology that hadn't existed in 2004 clearly showed the trajectory of the bullets fired during the struggle. The patterns proved that David had been wrestling with an armed intruder when the fatal shot was fired, exactly as he had tried to explain to police 20 years earlier. The new evidence led investigators to reopen the case with fresh eyes and better technology. What they found was a story that had been hiding in plain sight for 2 decades, obscured by hasty assumptions and inadequate investigation. Raymond Cole had been a career criminal with a history of increasingly violent home invasions. On the night of March 15, 2004, he had broken into the Carter house through the back door, intending to rob the family of cash and valuables. When William and Michelle Carter couldn't produce the large amounts of money Cole demanded, he had decided to kill them all to eliminate witnesses, a pattern consistent with his previous crimes. The truth finally emerges. David Thompson had arrived at the most critical moment, when 3 innocent lives hung in the balance. His intervention had saved the Carter family and ended a violent criminal's career permanently. He wasn't a murderer, was a hero who had sacrificed his freedom to protect others. The Carter family, contacted by investigators after the DNA results came back, confirmed what the evidence had revealed. With 20 years of distance from the trauma and terror of that night, they could finally see clearly what had happened. "We always knew something was wrong about the trial," Michelle Carter said through tears. "We knew David wasn't the person who had threatened us, but we were so scared and confused. That man saved our lives, and we helped send him to prison for it. We've lived with that guilt for 20 years. On September 12, 2024, David Thompson walked out of Jackson Correctional Facility a free man, 20 years, 5 months, and 27 days after being wrongfully convicted of murder. He was finally vindicated. The state of Michigan issued a formal apology and announced a settlement of $15 million for the wrongful conviction. Had his first press conference as a free man, standing on the courthouse steps where he had been sentenced to die in prison. David Thompson was asked how he felt about losing 2 decades of his life for being a hero. "I saved 3 lives that night," he said quietly. "If I had to make the same choice again, knowing what I know now, I would do exactly the same thing. Some things are more important than your own freedom." The reunion that healed hearts. David's first stop after leaving prison wasn't to collect his settlement money or give interviews to reporters. It was to visit the Carter family, the people he had saved and who had unknowingly helped convict him. The reunion was emotional and healing for everyone involved. William and Michelle Carter, now in their 60s, with grown children and grandchildren of their own, welcomed David into their home, the same house where he had saved their lives 20 years earlier. Their children, Michael and Jessica, now adults with families of their own, thanked the man who had sacrificed decades of his life so they could grow up. "I want you to meet your grandchildren," Michelle Carter said, introducing David to a group of young faces who existed because of his courage. "None of them would be here if you hadn't been brave enough to help strangers." David Thompson, now 54 years old, has spent the 2 years since his release rebuilding a life that was stolen from him. He works as a counselor for at-risk youth, sharing his story of how making the right choice isn't always the easy choice. He never married, dedicating his post-prison life to reconnecting with his daughter Emma and helping young people who remind him of himself at their age. A legacy of justice reform. The David Thompson case became a catalyst for criminal justice reform in Michigan and beyond. His story highlighted critical needs for better DNA testing, improved public defender resources, more thorough investigation of violent crimes, and protection for people who intervene to help others. Emma Thompson used her legal experience and her father's settlement money to establish the David Thompson Foundation, a non-profit organization dedicated to helping families navigate wrongful conviction cases. The foundation has already helped exonerate for other innocent people and provides support for families dealing with the complex, legal and emotional challenges of fighting wrongful convictions. Today, David lives quietly in a small house outside Detroit, close enough to visit the Carter family regularly, but far enough from the city to enjoy the peace he'd been denied for 20 years. Every March 15th, the anniversary of the night that changed everyone's lives, the Carters and David gather for dinner to commemorate not just survival, but the kind of courage that defines true heroism, the quiet power of real heroes. David Thompson spent 20 years in prison for being a hero. His story reminds us that justice isn't always swift, truth isn't always immediately apparent, and sometimes the people we should honor most are the ones suffering in silence, paying terrible prices for their courage. In a world where we often wonder if good people still exist, David Thompson proves they do. They're in our communities, making impossible choices, protecting others, and sometimes sacrificing everything for strangers they'll never see again. They don't ask for recognition or reward, they just do what needs to be done because that's who they are. The next time you see someone standing up for what's right, remember David Thompson. Remember that heroes don't always get parades or medals. Sometimes they get prison cells. But they do what's right anyway, because their character demands nothing less. What would you have done in David's position that night? Would you have risked everything to save strangers, knowing you might pay the ultimate price? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and let us know what city you're watching from today. If this story moved you, subscribe to Justice System USA. We're committed to sharing the untold stories of courage, sacrifice, and redemption within America's legal system. Every subscription helps us continue bringing these important stories to light. Stories that matter now more than ever. Until next time, remember that sometimes the greatest heroes are the ones whose names we never know, whose sacrifices go unrecognized for decades, but whose choices echo through generations. David Thompson waited 20 years for justice, but he never stopped being the man who would risk everything to save innocent lives. Justice delayed is not justice denied, not when people like David Thompson show us what true heroism looks like.